I mean, you can edit that out, right?
Exactly.
I kind of liked us disappearing with the power cut. I think we should leave that in.
In this video, we're going to be talking to our Ukraine correspondents who've been here in the country since day one of Russia's invasion. They're going to be answering all of these questions that you've been sending us on YouTube. My name is Aya Ibrahim, and I've actually just been sent here. And so I'm really excited to talk to these guys and, learn a lot from their experience and what they've been covering for the past year. We've tried really hard to get them all in one room, but as the nature of our job, each of them is somewhere out there reporting on stories. But I'll just start asking the three of you, do you remember where you were when the first bombs started falling on February 24th?
I will never forget. I was in Kiev City and I will never forget the sound of that first loud bang that woke me up early in the morning of February 24th.
What's the situation like where you are?
People have been waking up to explosions. I have heard several of them myself shortly actually after this televised address by President Putin. Then he's going to attack, first of all, eastern Ukraine. But as we are hearing the sirens here in Kyiv, there's right now a really complete bracing for a huge escalation.
And we came to realization that all that was speculated about weeks up until this day actually became reality. The full-scale invasion has started.
I was actually sleeping when the war started. I did not hear the explosions because we were in Donbass. I was there and I was supposed to go back that day, and Nick was supposed to replace me. And at 4 or 5 in the morning, my phone rang and it was Nick, and he said, "Look, it started. What should we do?" And we decided that we will travel back to Kiev, both of us, and that he would get off the train and we would pick him up there. And that's what we did, right, Nick?
Yeah, it was pretty bizarre being on that train because we were kind of close to some big, as it turned out, some big Ukrainian airfields that were being targeted.
Nick, what's happening where you are?
Well, I'm in a small town that's just waking up and trying to make sense of all these reports coming in. People here have told me they heard explosions coming from the direction of Kharkiv while it was still dark.
And even when you couldn't hear the direct bang, you could kind of feel the kind of impact, the shockwave, and the birds were all, it was still kind of dark, but the birds were going crazy. Obviously, they could feel that impact. And I think the thing that was even weirder was the fact that everyone on the train was just so calm and kind of unwilling to really kind of believe what was going on.
Yeah, and I guess a lot has really changed in how people live their lives since that, that fateful day in late February of last year. And that's something that our users are really, really curious about. So we have one user who wants to know, what's life like in a war zone? And what goes through your minds, our correspondents, when you're interacting with locals?
Maybe first to the everyday life changes all the time. There was a period in March after the war started. Nick and I, we left Kyiv briefly in the very beginning, but returned pretty quickly after a week or so. And Kyiv was absolutely empty, and life was really dimmed down to the very essentials.
As you can see behind me, there are very few people on the streets right now. Those whom you see, they try to not to stay out too long. Most people that you see, they're either walking a dog or they are carrying groceries or something. So people go out on the street for their needs, but people don't stay a long time on the streets. Of course, the situation has been and is tense here.
And that changed dramatically during spring when life returned to the capital and things went back to normal gradually. At first, maybe one restaurant and one hairdresser opened, and then more and more and more, until by early summer it was almost like before the war. Life was pretty normal until probably October, when these attacks on infrastructure, these massive rocket attacks started. And then a little bit the fear came back. People would hide again, for example, in the subway stations for some time, but then they would go out again and continue their life. And that's what it is like until now.
Yeah, I think for the most part, it is kind of extraordinary how people are able to kind of compartmentalize their experience. So people might have a family member, a cousin, a child, a partner off fighting, at the same time still manage to somehow go about their work, earn money, try and distract themselves by going to cinema or going to a stand-up concert. That all still happens in parallel.
What I find very astonishing, and I wonder how Nick and Mathias see that, who more often actually they go to the front lines as well, talking to locals who obviously can't just leave. Like, obviously we can exit, we can leave Ukraine and then come back, but the stories that the locals tell us, sometimes it is a lot to handle, because you're listening to them, and you hope by listening to them you give them some comfort, actually, because they can tell their stories and you can amplify them. But at the same time, you just really wonder, I wonder personally, how do people deal with this constant feeling of not knowing actually what is happening the next night, the next day? That is quite stressful, I have to say, yes.
Well, I'm trying to understand their situation and try to be adequate in what I ask, and try to tell them that they can also refuse to answer certain questions. But aside from that, I try to really keep it keep my professional composure, because I won't be able to do my job if I am too much engaging maybe with their fate, or if I let this kind of influence me psychologically.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is another side, one could say, quote unquote, side to the story, and that's obviously the Russian side. You guys are in Ukraine, but we've had quite a few questions from users about how do we integrate the other side of the story. One, user kind of perhaps provocatively said, mostly war reports are one-sided and don't include other side of the story. How do you include the other side of the story in your reporting? And perhaps I'll just flag here for our viewers that we did have quite sizable bureau in Moscow that was unfortunately, because of the authorities, shut down shortly before the war started.
Authorities have closed down DW's office in Moscow, revoking accreditations for all our journalists there, and has banned DW broadcasts in Russia as of today.
I have to admit, it's just simply very difficult. Yes, even though that DW Bureau Moscow was closed, we still have sources there in Russia. We still have information. But when I'm in Kiev, for example, or other parts of Ukraine, from where I'm hearing, Ukraine said that about the frontline advancement, Russia said this, but I have actually no information to prove neither side. Actually, it's not just the other side, but neither side sometimes to say, did this really happen? I think it's the place like a war zone where it's very important for a journalist to really say what he or she knows and what he or she doesn't know, and maybe include then in that story.
I mean, I do follow Russian Telegram channels, propaganda channels. These are Russian war supporters, war reporters who fully support the Russian invasion, and they post pictures on Telegram. They post their own materials, and sometimes you can compare. Like, sometimes there are incidents where you see the Ukrainian version and the Russian version. Also, these images, they travel from one side to the other and are used then in other channels and so on. So, of course, I try to include information from Russia, from the Russian side, as much as I can, and with, of course, what Fanny just said, the caution that is necessary, but we cannot travel to the other side. Often, like, people ask, why are you not reporting from, I don't know, Donetsk, or that's not possible. We cannot cross the line.
I was in Kiev from 2017, and we would, constantly every couple of months trying to get accreditation for Donetsk, Luhansk, and that was even at a time where I, as a DW journalist, had Russian accreditation. So I could go to Crimea with Ukrainian and Russian permission to do so, but I couldn't get access to Donetsk or Luhansk, even though I had a Russian accreditation. So we definitely made those attempts. We tried repeatedly, but they just didn't want us there, because I think they had a very clear idea of the story they wanted to tell the outside world, and they were only going to invite journalists of whom they were fairly confident that there would be some level of kind of sympathy, in inverted commas, and anyone else just wasn't welcome there. They didn't want people just walking around, looking for stories on the ground.
Moving on to your great reporting and all of the pieces that you filed for us in the past months, there've been dozens, and a lot of our users wanted to know about a memorable story that you worked on. Here's one question from a user. What's the best, quote, faith in humanity restored moment you've witnessed? And one that was the opposite of that.
There's one particular couple I remember that went back to Bucha. It was in May for the first time because they fled, obviously, in the early days. They went back to find out that their house burned to the ground, and they found 2 jars full of pickles. And this couple couldn't be happier about these 2 jars of food because they said the Russians didn't find this.
At least we still have this to eat. Life goes on.
And in Ukraine, so often, I've met people who could smile in the midst of devastation. And these are the stories, of course, that stand with me.
Just how people are keeping up, and that's something that shows very often, every day somehow, how people got busy in the beginning of the war, tried to do something, to get together some, I don't know, food and give it to refugees passing by in Western Ukrainian cities. It seemed like everybody at that moment was trying to do something he could, and many Ukrainians were surprised, and they were saying like, oh, I didn't know that we care so much about each other. It was definitely a moment that kind of brought people together, and the other moments where you feel like this is so desperate, that's mostly when you talk to people who have had some traumatic experience. I remember one example that was particularly sad and touching for me, and was when I was talking to a woman who was standing next to one of these mass graves that were exhumed, and her son was being exhumed from the mass grave.
I know that his soul is gone. I know this is just a body, but it's the body that I used to hug and love. It's my child. I cry every day.
And that's, of course, a terrible moment. I just had to turn away after finishing my interview and get back to compose myself.
I just want to go back to something that Fanny mentioned about how that's also kind of difficult on you guys covering the story day in and day out, coming in and out of the country, and maybe even for, I know, Nick, you'd been in Ukraine for years before to kind of see, this happen to the country. So what do you guys do to take care of yourselves mentally and your own mental health while covering this story?
I'm a bit uncomfortable talking about this because I'm very conscious of our privilege being able to come in and out and not having to kind of, be here if we don't want to be here, which is obviously the case for, at least our male Ukrainian colleagues.
For me, what helps most is this really immense privilege to be able to leave the country from time to time. And then I also try, when I'm out of the country, not to check my messages, not to check Twitter, not to check Telegram channels often.
I sorry, just to come back to that, I have to say my consumption of family gossip has gone up hugely. The more dramatic things are here in the Ukraine, the more I want to hear about kind of, some distant cousin's 60th birthday and what went wrong. And, I just love kind of hearing all those details and just kind of filling my head with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, maybe that'll happen to me as well. And finally, my mother will be happy. But she had a daughter who turned out to be a journalist. Maybe Sherry can cut that bit out. Our viewers are also really, really interested in the look forward, further into this conflict, or perhaps even out of this conflict. And one user wants to hear your impressions regarding hopes for a meaningful post-war reconstruction in our lifetime. Is that something that you see? Is that something that you feel might be on the horizon?
I think people are quite hopeful in Ukraine that there will be a rebuilding pretty soon when the war is over. But the question really is in terms of mental rebuilding, like just how many people will be affected mentally in a way that this may have an impact in terms of the future of the society as a whole.
I think the bigger kind of worry is how many of the millions of Ukrainians abroad, the refugees, how many of those people will actually come back. But I am hopeful. I've seen lots of Ukrainians, as Mathias mentioned, be kind of positively surprised by their own country, feel kind of invested and supported by each other. I've seen people kind of just talk to strangers in a way that I didn't see before. Just the small thing, and it's kind of seemingly meaningless, but just as I was walking back to the hotel tonight, a lady in her maybe late 40s slipped on some ice, and literally she was kind of immediately surrounded by 5 people trying to help her. She could barely kind of, escape from all the people trying to help her up and take her to the pharmacy, and people giving her advice on what kind of cream she should use. And that is definitely something you didn't see in Kiev before. There was quite a lot of, people were polite, but it was a pretty individualistic, pretty kind of, atomized society, and that definitely feels very different.
I think we'll leave it at that. Mathias, Fanny, and Nick, thank you for taking the time out of your reporting day for this conversation. Next, do I hang when everything is lost, or do we have to press save or something?